Let's move on to intrinsicism and subjectivism, and please keep logic, the method of non-contradictory identification, in mind. It's because objectivism recognizes the primacy of existence and the identity of the mind that it is characterized most fundamentally by method, not doctrine. Okay. This always calls to, when I think about objectivism being characterized in terms of method, not doctrine, I always think of Rand's famous standing on one foot characterization of objectivism, right? Where she says, and this is not a quote, but the gist is, well, I'm an advocate of capitalism, but more fundamentally, I'm an advocate of egoism, and most fundamentally, I'm an advocate of reason, right? Reason being a method, capitalism being a particular doctrine. So, we're on to intrinsicism. I'm going to define it in two different ways. Once as a philosophical thesis, and once as a thinking style. As a philosophical thesis, intrinsicism holds that abstractions exist apart from the mind, that they can be grasped directly as such without logical processing. As a thinking style, intrinsicism is the practice of treating ideas that can only be formed through logical processing as self-evident. Intrinsicism is the rejection of one of the two fundamental theses I just mentioned, two fundamental theses of epistemology. It's the rejection of the recognition that the mind has identity. Abstract ideas, that is, concepts, principles, theories, are formed by a method. They are not given. And the intrinsicist is someone who rejects that, either more or less explicitly as a philosophical position or implicitly in thinking style. Of course, most intrinsicists would not explain their position by saying, oh, the mind has no identity. But this is what it amounts to claim that a conclusion that demands evidence and argument, careful formulation, and ongoing integration can be grasped automatically, that it's self-evident. Okay? So, I'm first going to discuss intrinsicism as a formal philosophical theory, and I'm going to discuss one philosopher, Plato. As you know, he was the first systematic philosopher, and the centerpiece of his philosophy is his theory of forms, his solution to the problem of change. How can there be certainty, perfection, permanence, identity in a world like the world given in perception that is constantly changing? Heraclitus, predecessor of Plato's, had affirmed that change is ubiquitous. He had denied permanence and certainty. Parmenides had affirmed permanence and certainty, but he denied change. Plato tried to reconcile these positions by introducing a realm of timeless, unchanging, mind-independent entities, the forms. This is a realm that's radically different from the changeable, imperfect real world revealed by the senses. According to Plato, the forms are true reality. This computer participates in the form of computerness. This participation, right, it's sort of reflection of that form, stirs in your mind a recollection of the form of computer which your soul encountered before you were born. This is how knowledge of the forms, and all true knowledge is knowledge of the forms, is acquired through recollection. Okay? The forms are the ultimate example of abstractions with real mind-independent existence, right? They really are. There's a place, and these abstractions really exist there. Okay? So this is the first defining property of intrinsicism. The recollection Plato describes has the diaphanous quality I mentioned before. It's essentially the memory of a perception-like experience that you had before birth. So Plato's theory has the other basic property of intrinsicism. Awareness of these abstractions is perception-like. Now, the basic objectivist objection to Plato's theory is that it violates the primacy of existence. Valid theories are grounded in our experiences of the world. We have no experience of anything like Plato's forms. Introspection, I mean, go ahead and do it. Introspection reveals no recollection of direct prenatal experiences, right, of perfect abstractions. There's no evidence for Plato's theory. In fact, there's much evidence that it's wrong. The theory is a clever intellectual construct to solve the problem of change, to reconcile Heraclitus and Parmenides, but it's just that. It's a construct. A classical problem for intrinsicist theories is the problem of borderline cases. Can you see my gumballs here? Can you? Okay. So here I have some things that are doing what? Participating in the form yellow. Here I have some things that are participating in the form orange. Right? What about this? Right? It seems to sort of participate in both and neither. Right? Right? Now, of course, one answer might be to say that there's another form for another color, and that the rose participates in the form in that form. But if you carry that reasoning out to its logical and I think obvious conclusion, right, then each particular shade of color is going to have its own form, right? And so you have no abstractions at all, right? You just have a sort of parallel universe of particulars. Okay? This classical problem for intrinsicism. This gives us a chance to distinguish the intrinsic from the objective. So I'm going to pause and do that for a little while. Objectivism would say that the classification of this thing, here or there, well, it's a borderline case, and it's a question of context. Right? The question would be, why do we need to classify this thing in one or the other? Now, I've come from a context of photographic technology where we sometimes had to make very fine distinctions, right? And we therefore made the fine distinctions, right? The requirements of selling film, right? The requirements of being able to make these distinctions scientifically told us what classifications we had to make. Right? To give an example of a context, suppose I now have this context. I hope you can see my other rows, right? In this context, it seems clear that this guy has to be classified in with those, right? In this context, it seems pretty clear that this guy goes in with those, right? And in this context, well, we just don't have enough information, right? Of how to, it's a borderline case, and you don't care. And the reason you don't care is that the fact that Ross has put some gumballs and a rose on the table doesn't have any import at all to your life. There's nothing in your life that demands that you make this classification. Okay? Okay, now intrinsicism as a style of thinking. The intrinsicist fears uncertainty, and also, I think he fears the responsibility for complex tasks of judging, of abstracting. He wants concepts and principles to have the same automatic, direct quality that perception has. I'm going to discuss, in Intrinsicism as a Style of Thinking, 4 characteristic mistakes of intrinsicism. The first is context dropping. This is the big difference between the objectivist view and intrinsicist views of concepts. Recall the electrons. I've discussed this. The intrinsicist position is that either electrons do or do not reflect the abstract essence particle. Either they do or don't reflect the abstract concept's wave. Right. In some ways, electrons seem to have both, which is contradictory, and the intrinsicist is stumped. Right? But as I said before, wave and particle are concepts that were formed in a certain context, and they apply in that context. The atomic realm is simply a different context, a context in which these concepts do not apply directly, at least without modification. Essence, right? There's no abstract essence of particle out there in the electron. There's no abstract essence of wave, right? Essence does not exist apart from the mind. We identify some feature of a thing as essential as a way of organizing our knowledge efficiently by considering all the properties of a thing, a wave, say, and considering how they're related. We decide which properties are causally fundamental, which explain and thus summarize the most other relevant properties, right, in a given context. This is work. It means ongoing attention to possible changes in context, right? It isn't automatic, and the intrinsicist wants knowledge to be automatic. Another characteristic intrinsicist fallacy is appeal to authority. This is best summarized in my favorite bumper sticker. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Of course, what that bumper sticker means is the church said it, or the Bible said it, the Episcopalian authorities. So I think there are two reasons for the prominence of this fallacy. The first is psychological. The intrinsicist is motivated by the desire for certainty. There's a strong aura of certainty about simple dogmas stated with bold self-confidence by a charismatic leader. I know this is true because David Kelly told me. The second reason is epistemological. If you regard abstractions as self-evident, and the intrinsicist does, but somehow they have not evidenced themselves to you, why shouldn't you trust someone to whom they have been evidenced? Right? Somehow something's gone wrong with your direct awareness of these abstractions, but he's got it and he's telling me. Okay? Okay. Another way to cope, so the third thing, substitution of the concrete for the abstract, is another way to cope with the fact that self-evident abstractions are not being revealed to you. Okay? And this is to substitute something that is self-evident, or at least less abstract, for the broad abstraction. Since intrinsicists want abstract thought to be effortless and immediate, like perception, they'll often simply substitute something perceptual or something closer to the perceptual level for abstract thought. Racism is the classical example. Replace the complex task of judging individuals, a task that can take quite some time and effort before anything like certainty is achieved objectively. Remember, the intrinsicist hates uncertainty. With the virtually perceptual task of observing skin color, right, or other ethnic characteristics. Religious taboos are another great example. Even an active thinker with the best principles finds him or herself frequently challenged by new and subtle ethical situations. Effort, work, uncertainty. Replace these with simple, direct prohibitions. And those of you who have listened to George Walsh's lectures on religion or read his book on this topic know about this in detail. Don't eat pork. Don't get blood transfusions. Say 5 Hail Marys. Recycle. The fourth characteristic error that I'm going to talk about of intrinsicists is argument as a defense. I've said a few times that intrinsicists regard argument and evidence as irrelevant. I haven't said they won't argue with you. Okay, they will. But they use argument and evidence to defend their positions, not to arrive at them. When an intrinsicist presents arguments for his position, he is not giving an account of why he holds them. He is defending them against you. Right? I had a friend at the gym, like my Christian fundamentalist friend, poor Mike, 12 years in the past now, is not nearly the bad guy he comes out to be in this story. But in any case, one day he started talking about religion. And I said, well, I'm an atheist. He said, well, I think there's a God. I said, well, why? He said, well, and he gave me the first cause argument, right? Classical argument. Everything needs a cause, therefore the universe needs a cause, and that cause is God. I said, well, Mike, this is an old argument, and there's a classical refutation. Right? If your first premise is right, if everything needs a cause, then God would need a cause too. So if there was a problem, you haven't solved it. He was stunned. I don't know how he got through college. Somehow he learned the argument and not the refutation. But he was stunned for about 5 seconds. He said, well, what about all the order in the universe? I thank Mike for this, because I realized at that point, he is not telling me why he thinks there's a God. Because if the analogous thing happened to me, if I gave my explanation of why I think we have objective knowledge, right, that concepts are objective, and somebody said to me on the beach one day, well, here's a refutation of that, and it was a real refutation, I'd be absolutely devastated, right? There wouldn't be some backup little argument that I'd throw at him, right? I'd be absolutely devastated. But I realized that it doesn't bother him because that argument is not his reason. It's not a support. It's not the explanation of his position. It's just a defense. I think this is characteristic of intrinsiциsts. Okay? And in connection with this, I want to quote Descartes from his Meditations on First Philosophy. This is sort of the sort of preface where he's addressing this book to local religious leaders. He says, although it suffices for believers like ourselves to believe by faith, certainly no unbeliever seems capable of being persuaded of any religion except by natural reason. Right? And I think this is the characteristic intrinsicist attitude. Okay? All right. Oh, I was going to say something about doctrine rather than method. I mentioned earlier that objectivism recognizes method as fundamental. Intrinsicists like doctrine, right? They like dietary laws. They like the Constitution. Now, I like the Constitution too, right? But they like it as established, self-evident dogma. Okay. So we're on to subjectivism. Subjectivism is the rejection of the other fundamental thesis of epistemology, the primacy of existence. It's the endorsement of the primacy of consciousness, the view that the mind creates its objects. It does not observe them. The name subjectivism comes from the fact that in all awareness, there's a subject, a mind that's aware, and an object, the thing of which it's aware. A subjectivist is one who thinks that the subject creates the object, or at least endows the object with its identity. I'm going to define subjectivism as a philosophical thesis. It's the philosophical thesis that the mind creates or endows with identity the objects of awareness. I'm going to define it as a thinking style. It's the practice of treating the objects of awareness as if they conformed to ideas or wishes. I'm going to discuss one formal philosopher as in connection with subjectivism, and that is Immanuel Kant. He's the philosophical root of modern subjectivism. The central feature of his philosophy makes him an excellent contrast object for intrinsicism and for objectivism. Kant endorsed the thesis that the mind has identity. So he explicitly and importantly, endorsed the thesis that intrinsicists implicitly reject. He added the premise that therefore, the mind itself produces the identities of the objects of awareness. And he concluded that the mind is fundamentally out of touch with reality. Kant explicitly endorsed the second basic thesis and rejected the first. Just as Plato's purpose had been, in part, to answer Heraclitus, to protect the truth from being swept away in the flux, so Kant's purpose, in his theory of knowledge, was to refute the skepticism of David Hume. Hume, you'll remember, adopted a radical empiricist position, denying causality and necessity because they were nowhere to be found in sensory awareness. Kant attempted to ensure necessity for at least some conclusions by what he called his Copernican revolution. Kant's theory involved a shift from the primacy of existence to the primacy of consciousness that was analogous, he thought, to the Copernican shift from geocentricity to heliocentricity in astronomy. He proposed that certain aspects of our experience are contributed by consciousness. They are forms, different forms from Plato's, in which consciousness must organize empirical data, and therefore are not subject to the vagaries of that data. Remember Hume, data don't exhibit causality or necessity, right? The data can't account for that. Knowledge of these aspects of experience, therefore, are independent of any sensory data. Yet it contains real information about objects. Objects as they're perceived anyway, or phenomena in Kant's terminology. The price he paid for this certainty was that objects as they are in themselves, what he called noumena, are simply unknowable. So far from being an answer to skepticism, Kant's subjectivism worsens the problem. While it allows us to be certain of some conclusions about structures imposed by our own minds, it puts the entire real world outside the scope of our awareness. Okay? Kant's theory, of course, is in its details a complicated and an extremely influential one. George Walsh has some very nice lectures on this subject, and I certainly recommend them. I'm going to present two objections to Kant's theory. The basic objection is that it's self-refuting. As you know, this is what happens when you deny an axiom. Kant does not mean to be saying that his theory is a form that he has imposed on his personal sense data of an unknowable noumenal world. That's not what he means to say. He means to say that his theory is an account of the way things really are, that it's an account of the nature of reality, that it's objectively true. But the theory denies the possibility of such a claim. There's a specific technical point to make about Kant's theory, a point that gives some insight into objectivity. It's true that the nature of my mind, of my sense organs, my nervous system, affects the form of my awareness. This is form in yet another sense here. This is the objectivist sense. It affects the form in which I'm aware that of objects that exist and are what they are, independent of my awareness of them. Without this distinction, the form-object distinction, Kant's argument might seem persuasive. I'm looking at this thing, okay? And I'm perceiving it in a certain form, a sort of yellow-orange flower. Were I colorblind, or were the light in here different, the form in which I perceive it would be different. But I'd still be perceiving it, right? Now I'm aware of it from an olfactory perspective. Oh, it's nice. Right? It's got that sort of sweet classical rose smell. A different form of awareness, the same thing. Right? To say that we're aware of only form and not the only of the form and not of the object is incoherent. It's only by contrasting the form with the object that we understand that there is such a thing as form. right? How do I know if there weren't an actual thing here that I was sniffing and feeling and looking at? How would I know that sniffing and feeling and looking were three different ways of my experiencing the same thing? Okay? All right, on to subjectivism. Last real topic, subjectivism as a style of thinking. Okay, first thing I want to say is a mistake that appears to lend support to subjectivism is confusion of the subjective with the personal. It's a somewhat technical point, but boy, is it an important one. Because you hear the term subjective bandied about, and there's nothing wrong with this in most contexts, right, in sort of informal discussion. But people will say that the preference of butterscotch to mint or of Dvorak to Mozart is a subjective preference, right? You've all heard that. It's important to note that in the objectivist sense, in the serious technical philosophical sense, this is not a subjective matter, right? I prefer butterscotch. Okay, I love butterscotch. The fact that I prefer butterscotch is a fact about me. It's a fact about the interaction between butterscotch, right, and my taste buds, right? I taste it, it really tastes a certain way, and I really enjoy that more than I enjoy mint, right? Those are objective facts that I'm reporting. My preference for butterscotch is not brought about by my conviction that I prefer butterscotch. If it were a subjective claim, that's what it would be. Right? My thoughts about the matter would cause the matter, right? Would cause the fact. But that's not what's happening. This is personal. You may prefer mint and you may prefer Mozart, right? But that's a personal matter. It's not a subjective matter, right? You don't prefer Mozart because you think you prefer Mozart. Okay. Second point. I think one thing that leads to subjectivism as a thinking style is the subjectivist's awareness that he or she possesses volition. This is my example of the 15-year-old sister in the tomato case. At some point, we begin to realize our minds can't be forced to accept any particular conclusion. We have choice. Now, we understand that anyone's choice, the basic choice is to attend to the facts or not. Okay? The facts are what they are regardless of your attention to them. But the subjectivist, I think, is often a disillusioned intrinsicist. Once he realizes that abstract ideas are not intrinsic in reality, right? That he's not going to have that direct perception-like absorption of abstract ideas, they're not self-evident, he concludes that reality places no constraints on him at all. Okay? So now as I prepared the talk, I looked hard for specific features of the subjectivist's approach to ideas, things that would be analogous to the intrinsicist's appeal to authority, context dropping, substitution of concretes for abstractions. And I didn't find that many. There's sort of asymmetry between them in this sense. I think that's because the intrinsicist is looking outward, right, for things in reality that can be substituted for the task of sorting through data, forming concepts, developing his own independent judgments. And the external world, when he looks out, is fairly rich in possibilities, right? There are authorities of all types, right? There are cultural traditions, all sorts of particulars. You could, if you want to be a racist, think of the varieties of people you can dislike. The subjectivist is looking inward, right? And there's just not that much in there except your own mind, and the only other thing in there is your emotions. Okay? So, the one common feature of subjectivism as it's practiced is a named logical fallacy, the subjectivist fallacy, right? My neighbor committed it in the anecdote I told about religion, right? I feel that it should be this way, and so it is this way. All right? The last error I think I'm going to talk about, not yet, is reliance on arbitrary assertions. Subjectivists tend to rely on arbitrary assertions. You can't prove that there's not. UFOs, ESP, carcinogens in this or that food. This makes sense. The problem with arbitrary assertions is they fail to recognize that knowledge begins, right, that starting place I talked about before, it begins with the external world. Okay, that all knowledge must be based on observed facts. And of course, this is exactly what subjectivists reject. A particular form that's popular with practicing subjectivists that I've known is what I think of as the argument from, but what about? I should change that into some sort of argumentum ad, but what about? You go through a careful discussion of human nature, objective requirements of human life, the nature of the mind, volition of the mind, whole standard objectivist account for why we need egoistic ethics and a classical liberal society, and they'll say, but what about the poor? But what about the environment? If you ask, well, what about the poor? They have no answer, right? They just felt somehow the poor must fit in here, and practicing subjectivists tend to be skeptical. Remember Kant's basic argument, the mind has an identity, there's no way around that identity, so there's no access to objective reality. What you are is a product of your mind's identity, right? And we see that in today's relativists. Right? Cultural prejudice, they say, structures and determines your reality. An extreme example of this, a woman once told me that certain American Indians, standing on the shore of the Atlantic as European sailing ships approached, literally did not see the ships because nothing in their cultural programming allowed for such a thing. She said this seriously. I left. By distinguishing intrinsicism and subjectivism, we highlight different aspects of objectivity. But in practice, the most fundamental distinction is between objectivity and non-objectivity. Although many individuals emphasize one type of mistake or another, intrinsicism or subjectivism, they really are a package. Since abstractions are not out there in the world, they're not available without effort, the intrinsicist is ultimately a subjectivist. In reality, he thinks thus and such is true, or he feels thus and such to be true, he wants it to be true, and he projects his thoughts, his desires onto the world. Revelation, faith, just knowing all amount in practice to substituting emotion for thought. After all, if you're trusting the authority, you've got to ask, why, right? If you did try to do that rationally, why do I trust this authority? Ultimately, it's because he feels that the Pope or Mom, Deb isn't here, or Mom must be right, okay? Going back to the example of T2, Arnold doesn't get any argument or evidence for why killing people is wrong. But what he does get in the course of the film, and I really recommend the film, great film, what he does get in the course of the film is a glimpse of the emotional attachments that humans can develop. The world is what it is. Human life has rather stringent objective requirements. The subjectivist needs concepts and principles to survive. Since he's not consciously applying a method, he's acting as if these abstractions were just directly available to him. He's acting as an intrinsicist. The fundamental characteristic uniting intrinsicists and subjectivists is the refusal to take responsibility for the hard, ongoing task of attending to reality, identifying and integrating facts. Well, that's that. The fact is, being objective is hard work. To achieve certainty on some issues can require patience, persistence over years. I speak with the voice of extensive experience. It requires the courage to face facts, whatever they are. And it requires a special kind of emotional strength, the capacity to live with uncertainty, the willingness to admit to yourself that you don't know what you don't know. Now, in conclusion, I want to return to another perspective on ethics and its relation to epistemology. Okay? Our purpose is happiness, the emotional experience of life as an end in itself, not just the day-to-day joys of successes at work, time spent with friends, mastering a new skill. But the self-conscious, self-confident, integrated awareness of yourself as a skilled and successful person, skilled and successful in the art of living. Okay? Of course, productivity is essential to happiness, and objectivity is essential to productivity. But there's more to happiness. We all know people who are productive but aren't happy. We want to consider the other aspect of happiness, an aspect that's associated with terms like wisdom, depth of soul. To be happy, you must be able to reflect on how you live, to introspect on the methods that you use to advance your life, and to recognize that these are correct methods. But this means you must be using a method. If you're not using a method, if you're an intrinsicist or a subjectivist, you have no chance of achieving this component of happiness. The confident, introspective awareness that you have mastered the methods of knowing and dealing with reality is possible only to the degree that you're objective. The fact that you cared enough about objectivity to attend this talk bodes well for your prospects on this front. Thank you very much.